Everybody, if you could grab your seats, grab a cup of coffee, and welcome to our first Mitchell Forum hour of the new decade, 2020. We're very pleased to have with us today Major General Grynkewich, who is currently serving as the Deputy Commander, Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. He's also concurrently serving as the Commander 9th Air Expeditionary Task Force Levant, is responsible for ensuring the success of Air Force missions as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. Now, before I turn the podium over to him, I'd like to highlight the fact, known by several of you in the room, but which deserves some mention. 4 years ago, and I can't believe it was 4 years, has gone by so fast, General Grynkewich led a team investigating the future of air-to-air combat. The findings he and his team published were pivotal to defining how the Air Force will execute this critical mission in the future. They challenged long-standing assumptions and embraced an effects-based focus that was second to none. We are very fortunate that he agreed to publish an unclassified version of his team's findings as a Mitchell Institute forum paper, and you can get that document online to remind you of all the good work that he did in that regard. He's a very good friend of the Mitchell Institute and a tremendous asset for our nation's defense. And he's going on to bigger and better things at Central Command headquarters here in the not too distant future. So Grinch, without further ado, the podium is yours.
All right, thanks, and good morning, everyone. What I thought I'd do, I think this was billed as an operational update on the fight against ISIS. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of talk you through the things that have happened since I arrived over in the theater about 9 months ago. And then we can talk a little bit about recent events and where we think things are going to go in the future. And happy to take some questions at the end. So I'll talk for 20, 30 minutes or so, and then we can open it up from there. So I arrived in the CENTCOM AOR and over in Baghdad roughly the end of April of last year. So it was about 1 month after the fall of Baghouz, which was the last bit of physical territory owned by the ISIS Caliphate. A tremendous victory when that territory was liberated near the end of March, and I certainly won't downplay that. But I will tell you that ISIS is a thinking and learning adversary, and it's at our peril that we underestimate them and how they might react in the future. And a lot of the underlying conditions that led to the rise of ISIS still do exist in the region. It's about quality of governance, it's about empowering minority populations. Those sorts of things still need some work. Not really a military role, but more some of our unified action partners who play a leading role there if we can get the security situation stable enough for them to do so. So again, back to the fall of Baghouz and ISIS being a thinking and learning organization, what I would tell you, my observation was, after looking at a body of intelligence work and assessments that came out after that liberation of physical territory, is that ISIS probably knew that they were going to lose the physical caliphate some number of months ahead of time of actually losing it. And, you could see yourself as an ISIS fighter up against the might of the largest coalition ever in the history of warfare and realize that they, would have been fools not to come to that conclusion, if you will. When they came to that conclusion, let's say it was about 6 months prior to the fall of Baghouz in March. And Baghouz is that little piece of, there's some cliffs there right where the Euphrates River crosses the border between Syria and Iraq. When they came to that conclusion, they decided to divide their effort along into 4 areas, basically. And the first effort was to identify those people, I often joke, probably like me, good fighters but not so smart, that they can afford to lose. And they said, hey, your job for this quarter of our population is going to be to fight to the death. And we saw that around Baghouz. They were dug in deeply into those cliffs and the cave structures that were there. There was a massive humanity that's difficult to comprehend We thought, there were a few thousand ISIS fighters and families that were in the area, and the numbers far exceeded any of our estimates. So that group of folks was there to fight to the death, slow down the coalition advance in concert with our Syrian Democratic Forces partners, and in concert with the Iraqis who were blocking anyone from squirting out of the zone of conflict back into the Iraqi side of the border. And they were a speed bump, basically, intended to allow them some time to maneuver in other ways. So the other groups of people, there were three other groups. There were male ISIS fighters that they wanted to fight as long as they could, but they wanted to preserve some combat power. And those male ISIS fighters are now in the custody of the Syrian Democratic Forces primarily. There's a number of prisons on the Iraqi side of the border as well, but focusing on that final battle, a fair number of those that are still in the custody of the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria. The numbers are, around 10,000. If you think about it, it's about a divisions-ish worth of combat power in U.S. military terms. And a big focus of CJTF is trying to ensure that those prisoners are appropriately secured, cared for in a humanitarian way, and then try to figure out what is the long-term disposition of those. Again, not really a military problem to solve, but something that we're constantly trying to push efforts at repatriating those foreign terrorist fighters that are in SDF custody, trying to work with the Iraqis in order to take back some of the Iraqis that are in custody. And then, the outcome of the Syrian civil war will really determine what the final disposition of the Syrian element that's in prison there. But a fair amount of combat power that's there that we need to all be mindful of, and we've been very mindful of it. It's gotten a lot of attention in the press. One that's gotten a little bit of attention in the press, but perhaps not quite as much, is female ISIS fighters. Just like there were male ISIS fighters who ended up in prison, there were female ISIS fighters, and I mean fighters, not wives or family members, but women. We've got video footage of them standing on berms with AK-47s firing at the Syrian Democratic Forces as they advanced. But when it came time for them to surrender, they were able to pose as if they were not fighters and pose as family members, and they, as a result, ended up in IDP camps and internally displaced persons camps. And so the poster child for this aspect of the ISIS problem is Al-Hol, which is a camp in northeast Syria. It's been around for a long time. I think it originally started back during the first Gulf War, about 1991, as a place for refugees from that conflict. And the population hovered somewhere, 10 to 20,000 or so. It swelled to about 75,000 as Baghouz was falling and as the advance down the Merv happened. And still today, it sits just under 70,000 or so people in that camp. Of that, somewhere around 20,000 are female ISIS fighters, some female ISIS family members, and children. In fact, the population of children in the camp is, somewhere north of 60% of folks who have not reached the age of majority that are under 18 years old. And in the sections of the camp that are dominated by some of the female ISIS fighters and some family members as well, I acknowledge that they weren't all fighters, in those sections of the camp, the long-term concern that I think we should all have is there are no educational opportunities besides what those mothers are providing their children. And so they are being indoctrinated into that ISIS ideology and mindset. And so a fair amount of our effort, again, is trying to spur the international community to look at what are potential solutions for either repatriation of those individuals, reintegration programs, those sorts of things. Not something the military can provide, but we can, again, set that security situation in such a way that it allows those activities to continue. So those are three places. And I'll finally get to kind of the military dimension of where we are today, and that is the final place ISIS sent its folks after getting some people to surrender and go to either IDP camps if they were female or prisons if they were male, or to fight to the death. The final place is they asked some of their fighters to go back to their hometowns and reset for an insurgency. And so you've seen this in reporting over the last 9 months as the quarterly IG report has come out. I know many of you have picked up on some of the findings of that report. And what we really saw is folks who were from, say, the town of Raqqa or folks that were from Mosul returned to those places, established what we originally called sleeper cells, but they didn't sleep for too long in most places. And they started kind of this low-grade insurgency. And that's really the fundamental military problem that we faced from a fighting ISIS perspective today. So with that, just to broadly describe what that looks like, the really good news is in most places across Iraq and Syria, ISIS is just trying to survive. We have a 5-stage model of insurgency that we apply to them. We derive it actually from their own writing, so it's different than the Maoist model that some of you may be familiar with of 3 stages of insurgency. It's a 5-stage model. Stage 5 is when they control territory and they're a caliphate. They basically attain, proto-statehood. Stage 4 is control little pieces of territory, but they're all the way back at stage 1 in most places, which is we're hiding, we're trying to survive, we're husbanding our resources, building networks, those sorts of things, or trying to. In most of Syria, that's the case. In southern Iraq, that's the case. Up in the Iraqi Kurdistan region, that's generally the case as well. They're just trying to survive. There are some pockets in the lower Euphrates River Valley and across northern Iraq, out in Anbar as well, where they are at a stage 2 of an insurgency. That stage 2 is really no particular safe haven that they have, but they are able to execute kind of low-grade attacks, small-scale attacks to try to build their brand primarily, work on recruiting and try to build some capability, but pretty low scale. Stage 3 in a few areas, and there's a bit of an arc for those familiar with the Iraqi geography, from north of Baghdad and over toward the Iranian border in Diyala, up through Kirkuk and south of Mosul, over to the Syrian border, and some places out in Anbar where they're at kind of a low-level stage 3 insurgency. That generally is they have the ability to extort more resources from the population, but certainly not control the territory for any meaningful period of time. So they might have safe haven in a mountain or in a dry stream bed, a wadi system, in some caves. They come out of those at night, go down, shake down some folks, maybe kidnap for extortion, maybe threaten to burn a farmer's fields if they don't turn over crops, and then they retreat back to those supposed safe havens. So we do see some of that. It has been very instructive over the last little while that despite a number of discontinuities in the campaign, including the Turkish incursion into northeast Syria, and for those tracking the situation in Iraq, the protests across southern Iraq that have really distracted the Iraqi government, that ISIS has been unable to take advantage of those. So we haven't seen any meaningful uptick in their capability. We've seen a few additional attacks that have happened here and there, as you might expect when you pull the pressure off, but nothing substantial enough to make us think that they're at a higher level of capability. So that's really good news. The overall CJTF strategy in dealing with this insurgency has really been focused on enabling our partners to take the actions that they need to take. So on the Syrian side, that's primarily the Syrian Democratic Forces. We have a couple other forces that we work with down around the Atanf garrison and here and there. But primarily it's the SDF who have continued as we reset our posture in Syria to prosecute de-ISIS operations. And again, that area in the middle Euphrates River Valley, for those again familiar from kind of Dar ez-Zor to the south, has been one of the more problematic areas, and they've been able to prosecute fairly well with our help. On the Iraqi side of the border, we've long viewed the counterterrorism service, which is roughly analogous to their special operations component, as one of the most capable partners. But we also are mindful that they're not tremendously large of a force. And for those of you with a military background, you know that SOF can do some amazing things, but seldom is it decisive by itself. So it's a shaping force, it's an enabling force. And that's really how we still see CTS. They're able to go after certain networks, they're able to go after certain capabilities, but you really need the Iraqi conventional forces to have some level of capability and capacity to counter the threat. On the ground side, that's manifested in partnerships at their operations command. So these are a number of distributed geographical commands across Iraq. And at those ops commands, we typically have an Army battalion commander who's providing advice and assistance and access to things that airmen provide, like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to airborne fighter cap capability to go in and strike targets. Those sorts of things are connected there through that ops command. JTACs on the ground with each of those that can bring additional capability that the Iraqis don't have, as well as just advising them on where they ought to maneuver, where they need to go stomp around in the wild and try to find ISIS. And the Iraqis have gotten pretty good at it. They will do 10 to 20 operations a day, depending on the day, depending on the time of year. And this is across the entire country where they'll go out. They're typically a little bit shorter than we would want, maybe, and maybe they don't stay as long as we'd want them to in order to secure the terrain long term. But there's some really nasty terrain out there that most of us wouldn't want to stay in long term either. But they'll go out and they'll clear weapons caches. They'll arrest folks on terrorism charges. They'll call in strikes on safe havens, caves, or those wadi system tunnels that I described. And that's all goodness. On the Air Force side, we've been focused on a train, advise, and assist mission with the Iraqis to improve the capability and capacity of the Iraqi Air Force as well. And that's really started to pay some dividends. So a couple of years ago, we stood up a train and advise assist wing, the 321st Air Expeditionary Wing. And about half that wing kind of runs the airfields across Iraq and Syria. There's some great stories there about what airmen did at places like the Kobani landing zone that I can get into if you want. But the other half of the wing is really partnering with the Iraqis. So partnering with their 9th Fighter Squadron, which is their F-16 squadron, which we've seen prosecute a number of targets independently without coalition assistance or without much coalition assistance over the last 3 or 4 months. To the tune of just a couple of strikes a month perhaps, but certainly picking up the pace over time. Eager, willing, if any of you walked into that fighter squadron, it would be instantly recognizable if you'd been in a U.S. Air Force fighter squadron. It has the same feel to it. Very professional organization and highly capable on the operations side. Depended a little bit more than we want on contract maintenance, but that's probably not necessarily a bad thing. Probably an appropriate way for them to align their resources as long as we can make sure that they can afford it. They also have a ISR fleet of fixed wing ISR. That has been a journey as well to get them to use their own ISR, to develop targets themselves, and then build out packages that they can get their F-16s or other aircraft to go strike. They've actually done that entire kill chain a few times now and are building the reps. And so that air advising effort has been pretty helpful over time to get them to that point. We also do kind of the more mundane air advising, if you will. We've got folks who help them figure out how to maintain their C-130s better. They use those pretty regularly to move and shuttle cargo around. One of the big things we're trying to push is some of that integration between their air component and their land component, if you will, and drive them to think about calling each other for assistance before they call us for assistance, those sorts of things. But they've made some really good progress across the board. So that's the air advising piece. The coalition still, though, does provide a tremendous amount of air power capacity, both in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance at ISR, both manned and unmanned, and through fighters that are overhead. We're on a pace now where on a typical week, we're probably only doing 2 to 3 airstrikes per week. But when we do them, it has a pretty substantial impact. Often hitting some of the more valuable weapons caches that we find that ISIS has out in the area. The last piece of that, and one of the reasons the coalition's been fairly successful of late, I would argue, is as we moved from air being a supporting component to a ground schema maneuver, we've really tried to get back to the roots of where and how airmen think from a targeting perspective and think about targeting ISIS capabilities as opposed to discrete points on the ground. Nothing wrong with going after discrete points of the ground when you're supporting a ground schema maneuver. Don't take me wrong. But we've really looked at, okay, what does their C2 structure look like, and how do I hit the right nodes and links in that to have that C2 structure collapse? Another big effort going after, what's their finance capability? And this is a multi-domain thing, oh, by the way. So multi-domain, multi-agency. What can Treasury do? What can we do? In some cases, they bury money out in the desert. We can blow it up or have someone go find it. and seize it, or if it's in the banking system, maybe Treasury can go after it. There's a host of different tools that are out there. So we're trying to slowly degrade the resources that they have available to them from a global perspective as well. So that's where we are in the ISIS fight, focusing on that train, advising, and assist, trying to accelerate the Iraqis' ability to stand up and support themselves, looking at eastern Syria really as a zone that we need to continue to have a presence in to ensure that ISIS doesn't get access to resources that are there in the critical infrastructure in the oil fields that they used previously, and also as a bit of a buffer, if you will, for Iraq. And things are going pretty well, or they have been. So then the question that you guys all have is, well, what about all the stuff that's happened recently vis-a-vis Iran? So I'll comment on that briefly, and I'm sure there'll probably be some questions on it. Since it was shortly after I arrived in April that we went through the first period, I would say, of my experience over there, but the first period of kind of heightened tension with Iran, and it's percolated up and down, oscillated, if you will, over my time period that I've been deployed. So back in May, I've talked to a few of you, I think, before. We did have multiple threat streams. You guys hit the news quite a bit. Secretary Pompeo was engaged. Others were engaged trying to diffuse those tensions. But it was a period of heightened concern about what, in particular, the Shia militia groups in Iraq that are more aligned with the Iranian regime than they are with the Iraqi government, despite what it says on paper, and what they would do against the coalition presence there and how they might try to impose costs on us. What I would say is the way that we kind of view that at CJTF OIR is this is part of the operational environment that we have to deal with. And these Shia militia groups are unhelpful for a couple of reasons. First, they do have the effect of constraining some of our freedom of maneuver and where we are able to operate with our Iraqi partners. So that's one impact. The other impact is their ability to just plain out threaten us. So in the time that I have been in Iraq, we've taken a couple of casualties from ISIS fighting on the ground, but most of the attacks that have happened have come from those Shia militia groups who are launching rockets at our bases and frankly just trying to kill someone to make a point. So that again creates a security situation that constrains our ability to do what we're really there for, which is to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. The third way that those Shia militia groups are really a problem is they don't just attack the coalition forces that are there, but they're operating in areas that were traditionally policed by other tribal forces or by folks from the local area. So out in Anbar, for example, the Shia militia groups are the force that is operating across the border in many cases, providing border security in predominantly Sunni areas. Up in Nineveh, you've got a group, a Popular Mobilization Force Brigade, known as a bad actor, setting up checkpoints, extorting resources from the population up there. These are some of the underlying issues that are going to have to be solved if we're not going to have disaffected Sunni populations continue to feel the allure of an alternative ideology and extremist ideology like we see with ISIS. So the government in Iraq has made some progress in bringing those groups under its control. It's a constant challenge for them. There's a capability that those Shia militia groups have that we really have a hard time getting our minds around just how substantial it could be as a threat to Iraqi stability writ large, and certainly something that we'll continue to keep a very close eye on over the next while. So with that kind of as the context here, I've gone for about 26 minutes, I think, if I got my clock right, so I'll just pause here and see what questions you all might have for me. Yeah, there's one.
Good morning. I'm Brian Everstein with Air Force Magazine. Following up on your last point, does the pause in operations in Iraq continue? And has that been mostly ground focused to air operations continue? What has the impact of that pause been?
Yeah, so we're continuing to work with the government of Iraq on exactly how we'll resume full cooperation with them. There is continued contact and some advising at the lower levels. I think characterizing it as a full pause, it's really, I guess it's difficult to say exactly what the right word is to describe it. There certainly is de-ISIS activity that's ongoing, but most of our attention is undoubtedly on force protection and ensuring that we preserve the members of the coalition that are stationed within Iraq. The way forward is really going to be determined by discussions between our governments in the coalition, including the U.S. government and the government of Iraq. Those discussions are ongoing. I don't want to prejudge where they'll end up, but certainly we are looking to resume full cooperation across all lines of effort as soon as we possibly can. Yeah, we'll just kind of work our way around this way.
Hi, Laura Seligman with Foreign Policy.
Hi, Laura.
First of all, can you just address, I guess, to what extent, in your opinion, are these Shia militia groups under the control of the Iranian government? And then also, kind of separately, have you seen an uptick in violence and these sort of rocket attacks you talked about since the strike on General Soleimani a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, so the Shia militia groups are actually a pretty diverse set of organizations. Depending on how you count them, because there's a number of subgroups, there's over 100 of them that exist out there. There's some that are much more concerning to us than others that are generally more Iranian aligned. But a good example would be Sadr. Muqtada al-Sadr has his own militia. We don't actually see that as being Iranian influenced. We see that as being controlled by him. Sometimes his interests align with the Iranians and sometimes they don't, but a fairly independent actor. There's a number of others that we think do broadly respond to direction from Iran, and Soleimani was a big part of that direction, and he expended tremendous energy to keep all those pieces aligned. So in the post-Soleimani world, what remains to be seen is how much do they continue to respond to the Iranians, either as a constraining influence when the Iranians say don't do something or when they try to get them to do something on their behalf, or how much do they operate in their interests. And I just don't know where that's going to go. But there is a pretty hefty group of them that historically, I would say, have responded more so to Iranian direction than even to their own governments.
And then on the attacks.
Oh, on the attacks. Yeah, so, I think what we've assessed is that we can probably expect continued, I'll call it harassing fire. We saw that just a couple nights ago at the Baghdad Embassy complex. We've seen it at a couple of other bases over the last few weeks. My personal assessment is there's more continuity in that approach from where we were 4 or 5 months ago than a difference and a change post Soleimani. It's difficult to know. These are pretty unsophisticated attacks in some cases. Some cases are a little more sophisticated where they have a rocket truck that they've put together as a rocket launcher of some sort, multiple rocket launcher, but most of them are a couple of fighters running out into a parking lot, setting up some rails and launching rockets, and it's very difficult to attribute where that comes from. The Iraqis, by the way, just as a point of context, very responsive to going out, we can identify the point of origin pretty quickly with our ISR and our systems. The Iraqis will go out, they'll collect the rails, they'll try to exploit as much as they can off of them to learn that. Yes, sir.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. I have a follow-up on one of the previous questions in your response. Could you please explain a little more what training and advising is not going on and what is going on is with this suspension of some of these operations is since January 5th, and then NATO suspended on January 7th. Is the U.S. still training the Iraqi army? Is it still accompanying the CTS in the field on the soft level? Is the air training that you discussed, air advising, is still continuing at Balad and elsewhere in any significant way? What is it that's not happening? Because you sort of sidestepped that a little bit. And then also, how is ISIS responding to this? Presumably, this is to ISIS's advantage.
Yeah, so I can't really get into the specifics of what precisely is going on and what's not going on. as that gets into some of the classified space. What I can say is that, broadly speaking, most training activities have stopped. There are a few that are ongoing. Most advising activities at the lower level are ongoing. Some of the higher level advising efforts have stopped. But really, where we are is we're responding to the demand signal from the Iraqi government. And so, what that demand signal looks like is going to be a higher level discussion than just a military discussion. And that's why I really can't get into the specifics more than that. Because I don't want to prejudice the outcome of those discussions, if you will. On how is ISIS responding, that's a terrific question. I think in the short term, I kind of mentioned it up front, but just like during the Turkish incursion, we have not seen a significant uptick, even in the last 3 weeks, of ISIS activity to the extent that it would be overly concerning to us that they're going to suddenly resurge in a month. I would say that over the longer term, the less pressure that's put on ISIS, given that those underlying conditions still exist, we certainly want to get back to providing that overall pressure to keep them down and ensure they're enduring defeat. So short term, we're probably okay. We've got some time to work through this with the government of Iraq from both a coalition and a NATO perspective. Longer term, certainly a concern that because those underlying conditions still exist, if we don't get back on ISIS, there'll be issues. But, again, one good thing, one positive I'll highlight is, don't want to take credit for it. The Iraqis deserve the credit, but they have kept their own pressure on ISIS during this time. Just yesterday, a couple of raids went out. They're doing clearance operations regularly. So the fact that they're able to do that themselves is, actually one of the things we were trying to get to as a coalition. So she's been asking to ask a question way in the back was the first hand up and I ignored her. Sorry.
Thanks. Sarah Sirota with Inside Defense. For 7 years, actually more than 7 years now, former Marine and journalist Austin Tice has been held in captivity in Syria. I know this might not be your exact area to speak to, but I was wondering if you could give us any update on his status or negotiations for his release that you might be aware of.
Yeah, actually, I'm not aware of that particular case. I'm sorry. Okay, we'll work our way over to this side of the room, and then we'll come back.
Yes, sir. In the campaign against ISIS, and I understand that it's, had its kind of evolution so far, but could you characterize the weight of air effort versus ground effort over the length of that campaign? And then could you describe, U.S. Air Force, what have we committed in terms of air assets to the campaign?
Yeah, you bet. So it's difficult to divide the weight of effort in my mind. And some folks who have heard me talk before will hear me say that, joint warfighting is really about synchronizing the efforts of across domains. It's like my theme song. That's okay. So it's about synchronizing the application of capabilities from multiple domains to get different effects. And so, I think there's over the course of the battle against ISIS, it's been a very tight air-ground integrated team from both a soft perspective and an air power perspective that tried to bring together the right capability at the right time in the right place. There's some times when I think we probably took an approach that maybe had we thought through it more, we might have taken a different one, particularly early in the campaign. But to give you some idea, I'll tell you what is king in this battle is ISR. So literally hundreds of thousands of hours of ISR have been flown trying to develop out the ISIS networks that exist over the course of time since 2014. That continues to be a tremendous weight of effort as they go to ground and that trying to reset for that insurgency. From a strike perspective, over 35,000 strikes, air-to-surface strikes have occurred over the course of the campaign. Some of those out in the middle of nowhere, and some of those right in Mosul or Raqqa, which suffered tremendous damage as ISIS moved from place to place within the cities. So I think hard to characterize that weight of effort, as those were all in conjunction with ground maneuver and forces that were flowing in, Iraqi-led or Syrian Democratic Forces led, with our teams advising and assisting as they went. The Iraqis, and the SDF, I'll get the numbers wrong if I say them, but they have lost, combined tens of thousands of soldiers killed in this battle. And we don't need to forget their sacrifice as well. As for what the U.S. Air Force has provided, a big part of it has been the ISR that we bring to bear, both from a manned and unmanned perspective. That has been substantial. Various times we have had bombers in the mix, but mostly it's been fighter support to that ground scheme of maneuver. The other thing that I haven't mentioned is we do fly a fair amount of defensive counter-air that we will execute over Syria, with the number of players that are over there from the Syrian regime and the Russians. Keeping American or coalition aircraft over American or coalition forces on the ground is definitely a priority for us, and not have the Russians up overhead or the Syrian regime. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Jeff Strobel, Aspen Purpose.
I'm wondering, can you estimate about how many Russian private security contractors, such as Wagner, are currently operating in Syria and perhaps elsewhere in your AO?
That's a good question. I don't know the current number, but we certainly see a presence from folks like Wagner that are still out and about. I guess my commentary on it would be, we tend to use that label of private military contractors, and I'm not sure it's the right label. And this is more of an intellectual discussion, not something that's a statement of policy, but kind of an Alex Grynkewich opinion. I think that label is probably not the right one. They act like soldiers, they follow orders like soldiers, they execute like soldiers, and I think we need to think of them somehow more aligned with that role, since really their cover of being responsive to the Russian government has been removed. But certainly see a fair amount of their presence. It's been around for a while, but I don't know the exact numbers. Yes, sir. See, this podium is canted this way, so
Normally, nobody ever says that, I need a microphone to be heard, sadly. Vago Muradian from Defense and Aerospace Report. Two-part question. Part one is, no matter how much we may want to stay in Iraq, and there are some people who want us to stay in Iraq, there are still politicians who have to respond to their electorate. So in the event that we're asked to leave Iraq, what are the implications, and how does this fight go on, and what can we do in that case to defend and project force to allow outcomes that are favorable to us? That's the first question. Second question is, since Soleimani was killed, and he was somebody who did have exceptional bandwidth, was fluent in Arabic, his relief is not as fluent in Arabic, for example, as he is, and doesn't know the players in as intimate detail. Have we moved the needle there at all in terms of the behavior of either the militias or the overall vector of the campaign, or do you see this sort of as a strategic pause for reassessment before Iran gets back to doing what it's doing?
Yeah, if I could, I'll take the second part first, and because it's an easier answer. I think it's too early to tell what the overall impact will be. As I mentioned, I do think Soleimani was a gravity figure in the entire Iranian threat network, but what the implications are over time, how long it takes to replace him, in terms of not his named successor, but the kind of capability that he brought to bear, I think we just don't know at this point. I certainly don't know at this point. But certainly it's clear to me that it will have an impact, and an immediate impact that'll be lasting for some substantial period of time. On the question about what if we were asked to leave Iraq, I actually don't want to get into that hypothetical, because I think that's it is hypothetical, I guess, up front. What I tell you is, of course, we're military planners, we're prudent planners, we're going to think through a number of different contingencies. The government of Iraq voting us out, it's interesting if you go back and look at how that went. The Sunnis and the Kurds in Iraq actually abstained and didn't even show up in the parliament. They barely got a quorum, and then a majority of a barely quorum is what what voted the first non-binding vote for us to leave Iraq. So I don't think it's representative of the Iraqi population writ large across the three major subgroups. I'd also tell you that the polling data that I've seen shows that even among Shia, it's much less clear that they want us to leave. It's certainly more clear to me that they are just as frustrated with the level of Iranian influence and activity and the corruption that drives in their country as the rest of us are. So I think it's very much too early to tell exactly how that plays out. But great question. Yes, sir. Come over here.
Air Force Magazine. So you talked about ISR assets and how valuable those have been. To what extent do you have all the assets that you need? And if you have shortages, what are those shortages?
Yeah, so, military commanders always want more, but I think I'd be hard-pressed to say we have a shortage. U.S. Central Command and really the department and all the coalition members who contribute in this area have been absolutely tremendous in meeting the requirements as we have. There's always going to be a balance with other fights, even within CENTCOM, going over to Afghanistan, for example. But in general, I would say that we have not had a shortage of ISR to the degree that would be meaningful for me to make a comment of it. There's certainly times when we're suboptimized, and I wish I had one more cap that I could put somewhere to track one more ISIS fighter going through the desert, but probably not something that would have a campaign level effect. The types of capabilities that have been very useful for us, the RPAs with their persistence, that's very helpful in target development. It helps us characterize a target as a military target and something that is owned, operated by ISIS, whether it's an individual or a location. And that kind of persistent stare has been tremendously helpful. That's probably the capability we rely on the most. The Iraqis, by the way, contribute to this ISR picture, not from an airborne perspective as much, although we're trying to get them there, but from a human intelligence perspective as well. So very, very robust networks. And we'll often see, queuing from some other non-airborne source that allows us to go stare at something for a while and fully characterize it. It's been a good layering of those intelligence effects, if you will.
Are there other things that you would like to have more of that we don't have?
My personal view is we're appropriately resourced. We're appropriately resourced from a ground component perspective, I think. General McKenzie's been very supportive when we have asked for additional capabilities. A good example would be we brought in the Security Forces Assistance Brigade for a while, and we're able to get some good visibility at lower echelons of the Iraqi Army on what their performance was. And then, we're on a path because of where we are in the campaign to be looking at our long-term footprint, I think. And so those discussions will continue, and we'll see what is the right mix of capabilities given where we are and that it's 9 months since the fall of Baghouz and the physical caliphate going away. But I feel like we're in pretty good shape. Yes, sir.
Eric Schmidt with the New York Times. Just to follow on to one of the earlier questions, and then another one. Since the Iranian missile attack on al-Assad and Erbil, what have you noticed about IRGC activities with their ballistic missile force movements, their naval forces? What are they doing? And then the second question is, there are reports that additional U.S. forces from Iraq have been sent to Germany, Landstuhl, for medical treatment for concussion symptoms. Why did the military delay so long in discussing this, in moving these people out, and to what extent was the military influenced by the White House comments that there were no fatalities, there were no injuries in this delayed response? Thank you.
Yes, sir. So a couple of things. No, that we were not influenced by anyone, and really from my perspective in the field, we didn't delay talking about anything. I think it takes a bit of time for information to work its way up the chain of command and certainly get into the national capital region and be propagated when things happen. TBIs are very difficult to assess, especially in the wake of an attack. You're looking for people with cuts and bruises and those sorts of things. We were looking for to make sure that we didn't have any fatalities, and that initial focus then leads to follow-on assessments of, okay, how close were different people to different blasts? And then we go, okay, out of an abundance of caution, we probably need to apply concussion protocols to some folks. So it really just takes some time for the commanders on the ground to get through their assessment period, and then some time for that to percolate up for us. But there were no delays in medevacs or anything of that nature as the picture became clear, and certainly no influence from anyone outside the military on how we could talk about that or should we talk about it. From the IRGC and what their activity has comprised of, we're certainly watching that closely. I think we're, as discussed, we know who has taken Soleimani's place. We're trying to see what does that, what amount of, I guess I could say, WASTA does he have within the network? Who is he able to influence? Are people going to be responding to his leadership or not? A long-time IRGC operative himself was the number 2 to Soleimani, but was kind of the guy who, managed things in the background as opposed to the visionary leader. So we'll see how that plays out. We're watching it very closely. We certainly do see continued IRGC activity across the area. If I could pause on al-Assad for just a moment. So I would tell you that the results at al-Assad were, and the fact that we didn't have any fatalities, it's been talked about publicly that we did have some amount of warning. And then based on the amount of warning that we had, which I'm not going to further characterize, I know someone will probably ask me to, but I won't. But based on the amount of warning we had, low-level commanders, airmen and soldiers primarily on the ground out there, made some tremendous decisions in a time of great ambiguity. And it's those decisions to move forces around, to get people to bunkers, to do all the things that they needed to do in rapid order that led us to the results that we had. I'm tremendously proud of those folks that are out on the ground. I was out at al-Assad 2 Thursdays ago to talk to the commanders, do an assessment of the damage, and I just couldn't be more proud of them and what they did. In a time like that, you really don't know what's going on. You don't know, is this the only mode of attack? Is something else going to happen? Security forces are up on the wire, manning towers throughout the attack, staying at their posts. Just tremendous, there's probably hundreds of small acts of bravery that we could highlight from that event. Again, I couldn't be more proud of our leaders, soldiers, and airmen that were out there. In the back.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Felcher with Politico. Following up on that, I wanted to get your response to some of the president's remarks this morning, downplaying the injuries that were sustained, saying they were just headaches and that he wasn't that concerned. Defense leaders have made prioritizing, reducing the stigma around TBI a priority for them. So what message do those remarks from the president send?
Yeah, I haven't seen his remarks, and even if I had, I wouldn't comment on them. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Yvonne Davis, and I'm a foreign policy contributor to the Daily Signal.
Hi, Yvonne.
I wanted to ask you a question, sir, in relation to the psychology of the Iranian people. With the air crash that happened, and they were mourning and they took responsibility, how much of that is maybe a game so that Iran could plan with Ghani, who's now replaced Soleimani, to have an attack? Because it seems like Ghani will have something to prove himself that he actually could rise to the occasion of Soleimani. Do you know what I'm asking in terms of the site? Everybody's mourning, there was rebellion in the country, and now it's quiet. How much of that in terms of Iran's psychology as they strategically, patiently plan their next move?
No, that's an interesting question. I'd actually, I'd answer it by maybe stepping back to a broader palette of things that I would just say as an observer of Iran. I think there's a fair amount of disaffection within the Iranian populace. That's manifested itself in a number of protests, as you absolutely correctly highlight, and there have been some very brutal crackdowns against those Iranian protesters. I think there's in the wake of the Soleimani strike, there was a fair amount of people kind of forgetting that, rallying to the Iranian flag, if you will. And then then it became clear that they were lying, at least in the first 24 to 48 hours, lying about what had happened with that airliner. I think that broader narrative of the fact that the Iranian government can't tell the truth to its people, can't take care of its people, et cetera, is what's really the long-term thing that they're going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with. So I don't know that to the specifics of your question that I can tie it together as something that was, I certainly don't think it was done intentional. I certainly could see, irrespective of that airline crash, that as you try to consolidate power, if you're Ghani, that you may want to take some sort of action, but I'd hesitate to say what that might be or how he might approach it. And he doesn't, my assessment would be he doesn't really have the freedom of maneuver that Soleimani had, the access to some of the leadership that Soleimani had. So it'll be difficult for him to build that base, I think. Yes, sir.
George Nicholson with Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. Last week at a forum that Vago moderated with General McConville, he got asked about air defense capabilities. You look at what happened last year with the catastrophic damage on the Saudi airfields, and none of the, oil fields, nothing was able to stop them. That almost all the missiles that were fired in the last couple of weeks, that none of them were intercepted. And the only ones that failed were mechanical failures. What kind of a deficiency do you see that, and you see a real shortfall in developing that kind of increased capability?
Yeah, this is harken back to my, from the introduction that General Deptula gave, working on the future of air superiority. One of the things that we were concerned about over the long term is the ability of any adversary to project power using ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, which I would argue the one-way UAVs are just really slow cruise missiles, if you will. The ability to project power and deny basing and access in different places that would force us to further standoff ranges. I think that's kind of what we see playing out at the strategic level over time is the increased reach of long-range precision fires from a number of different potential adversaries out there. Results in basing and access challenges. From the specifics of the situation in U.S. Central Command right now, I won't speak for the overall design of the defense laydown that CENTCOM has asked for and that's been supported. I think it is fair to say, though, that we are challenged in the capacity that we have to deploy. We don't have an unlimited number of Patriot batteries or THAAD batteries that we can bring to bear. We can certainly fly some number of air caps, but they have, different aircraft have different capabilities against different threats that are out there, and certainly wouldn't be something that you would look to use against ballistic missiles that are coming in. And so, as an airman, I'd tell you the best way to go after a ballistic missile problem is to get them on the ground before they launch. That's not the space we're in right now, and I'm not advocating for something like that in this case. But I think it's just going to be a long-term problem for us to get our minds around how do we defend against something like that. It's going to have to be a layered approach with multiple layers of defense from both an Army and an Air Force perspective and a Navy perspective. Back in the back, and then we'll come up here. Yikes.
Hi, my name is Grigory Dubovitsky. I'm a correspondent with Russian news agency. So I have two questions. First, you mentioned that there are some terrorists still in Syria and Iraq. So how many are still there? And the second question is how long the coalition is going to stay in Syria. Can the Syrian government lead the fight against ISIS with Syrian Democratic Forces from the military standpoint? Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't have it's really difficult to count the number of ISIS terrorist fighters that still exist. I could give you a number, but broadly speaking, I'd say across all of Iraq and Syria, there's probably thousands, but there's, not to sound too flippant about it, but there are degrees of ISIS-ness. And so there's a question of who are the hardcore ones that will just have to be captured or killed, and who are the ones that we might be able to pull away from that might choose a different path if we're able to get good governance in place. With respect to the Syrian regime, I think that's probably the biggest challenge that I would say is that it requires good governance to ensure the lasting defeat of ISIS, and I'm not sure that the regime is best postured to provide that.
Last question.
Sir.
Thank you. Dan Lamoth with the Washington Post. More broadly, aside from the president's comments, CENTCOM has been quite vague in what we're looking at in terms of injuries, whether they're severe, whether they're not. Can you provide, I guess, any update, any detail on the severity or lack thereof of the injuries that we've seen on the al-Assad attack specifically, and in terms of the number of people who are likely to need some sort of treatment?
Yeah, so the numbers that I'm tracking are, in the teens that were looked at for TBI. I don't actually have an update on the severity of the injuries. I've been out of the AOR for about a week now, so I'm not tracking the specifics of where any individuals are. But I guarantee you that, we got the folks to Landstuhl who needed to get to Landstuhl. We evaluated some folks on the ground in Iraq, I'm sure, before we made those decisions. And we'll do whatever we need to take care of those soldiers or airmen who are injured. Okay, I think I'm getting the hook, but thank you all for the discussion today. I appreciate the questions.
Thanks very much. Let me grab that book over here for you. Well, I think all of you would agree that General Grynkewich did a magnificent tour de force of what's going on currently in the region. We very much appreciate that. We've got a little token of our appreciation for you. It's a book by Colonel Bud Anderson, Memoirs of a Triple Ace. And as you go back and forth from the theater, perhaps you can find some time to look at how air warriors in the past met their challenges at the time. So thank you very much. While I've got the podium, I can't resist but making a comment with respect to the air-based defense question. It's an extraordinarily important mission. It's a primary mission of the United States Army. One needs to ask the question, why are they pursuing things like 1,000-mile artillery and hypersonic weapons as opposed to doing their missions of air-based defense? That's one. The second one is you're going to see a full book-length version or a treatment of the strategy of the United States as they approach the Islamic State, come out this year as a Mitchell Institute book, and take a look at perhaps instead of a ground-centric strategy, if we took a more air-centric approach, could we have not collapsed the Islamic State in 4 months rather than 4 years? So stand by for that. So please join me in thanking General Grynkewich for his time. Thanks, Grinch.